Okay, we'll get started then. Welcome everyone. How is AgileCamp going?
Good.
Good? Big thumbs up? Excellent. So I'm Greg Cohen. We're going to be talking about what we call untangling the MVP, our minimum viable product, and how to accelerate product market fit. A little bit on myself. I've been started in engineering, mechanical and electrical, worked at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution doing global climate research, and then moved into the world of product management. I got my MBA, I worked in medical devices and diagnostics. This was all on the East Coast, came out to California during the dot-com, got involved in this very fascinating field with the internet that later became SaaS, this idea of hosted software, and then have been working on the consulting side of product management, helping product management and product owner teams really reach new levels of effectiveness. I love to write. My first book was 2010, Agile Excellence for Product Managers, followed by an ebook on Lean for product managers and a collection of contributed articles and 42 rules, and just very happy to announce too my latest book, Strategy Excellence for Product Managers, that launched last month. This came out of, since 2010, I've been really advocating for product managers and product owners. Well, product owners would embrace Agile, product managers haven't, about really understanding how you can use Agile for competitive advantage. But there was this unintended consequence that as engineering teams got really good at being agile and being flexible, I feel like many product teams I work with now have become reactive, and they've lost some of this art of strategy. This book is about how to fuse those two together. The concepts today sort of parallel some of what's in the book, but this talk isn't about the new book that's coming out. The goals for this presentation in particular are gaining clarity on what an MVP is and how to use it, so that minimum viable product. And there's some interesting stuff that happened in the history, I think in the evolution of this term, that I would like to clear up in this talk. And then understand why MVP is such a key milestone for product teams to achieve, and then provide a framework for how to get to MVP. Now, before we get into it, I was just going to start with a quick quiz for everyone in the audience. And I want to know, does anyone know who said this phrase? Test your way to rapid success. Any guesses on that?
Deming.
Huh?
Deming.
Deming. It's a good guess. It was not Deming, but you're on the right track.
Dan North.
Who's that?
Dan North, founder of BDD.
A founder of BDD? Okay. No. Anyone else?
Greg Cohen.
No, I wish, yes. I wish I could have attributed that to myself. Steve Jobs. Here's a few other things this individual said. He said, when an idea surfaces, ask these questions. Where are you going to test it? When are you going to test it? Can't you test a piece of it sooner? Can't you do the first test in less time? Can't you chunk it more? And what did you learn from this test? Eric Rees. Another good guess, but Steve Blank. Another good guess. Henry Ford. Now you're somewhere, but between these time periods. I don't know that Henry Ford was into testing, right? He just assumed the customer was an idiot, right? They would just have asked for the faster horse. Okay.
And the cheaper one.
And the cheaper one. It was Tom Peters. He said this in 1987, or wrote this in this book, Thriving on Chaos. Time to first tangible test is what he was talking about. Try, test, and adjust. Speed up innovation by dramatically increasing rates of failure. And I show this because I think historically we should understand these ideas that are really catching fire now are not particularly new. What is very new is the technology we have to be able to do this and do this quickly and do this at speeds that were not achievable back in this day. Gary Hamel in 1991 talked about this concept of expeditionary marketing. Very similar about this idea, you got to get out there in the marketplace to understand how customers are going to react to your product. When he was describing companies that were using this method, he said they could get a product out in 1 year. And he was comparing that to the state of the art in 91, or what most companies were doing, which was 3 years between idea. So we've seen this huge compression there, and this ability now with this technology to take advantage of things. So I wanted to sort of put that in context for you, and then talk about my own journey real quickly, just so you understand my point of view and how I came, I guess, to have the beliefs I have and become the evangelist, and why I evangelize them. So for me, my exposure to lean and agile methods was when I worked at ideaLab in 2000 and we were working in a very uncertain marketplace. ideaLab, for those who haven't heard of it, was one of the very early incubators during the .com, sort of what accelerators are today. And it was my first time that I got to work in an office where all the walls were cut in half. And I got a firsthand experience understanding just that power of communication, being able to see people on your team. We weren't visualizing our work or anything, none of that, none of the Kanban boards. But I understood how much quickly we could move just by increasing communication. And it was my first exposure to Agile, in particular extreme programming, and saw how that accelerated what I could do and how it relieved the burden on me to be right way up front on a market that didn't even exist. Right, which was an amazingly hard challenge, and it was great. And we had this idea, I don't know if any of you are cooks and know how to cook spaghetti, but you know when it's done, does anyone know that? Throw it on the wall and see if it sticks, right? And that was the expression we had. We didn't have the word MVP, but it was this idea, get it out there in the market early, see if it sticks, see what needs to happen, learn from customers using it. And then Lean Startup came along, right? And Eric Ries and his mentor, Steve Blank, and just did this fantastic job of giving a language to and codifying these methods. And he has this build, measure, learn loop. And for me, the fascinating point in this, and if you go back to March 2009, Eric Ries described the minimum viable product as, the minimum viable product is that product which has just those features and no more that allows you to ship a product that resonates with early adopters, some of whom will pay you money or give you feedback. So the idea here very much was we're going to build a product, we're going to test it with real users, and then we're going to iterate quickly, right? And that's the loop you go through. And during this same time, people started to play with this model. And they said, well, I don't necessarily need to build a product. I can just put up a web page and pretend the product exists. I can do a smoke test. I can see who's going to go through it and click buy, and I could measure people's interest in the product. So by later that year, by August, Eric Ries kind of changes the definition a little bit of an MVP. And it becomes the minimum viable product is that version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. And we go from building a product to building an experiment, testing with real users still, and iterating quickly. And this, to me, opened the door when we made this shift and said MVP isn't a product, that almost anything could be an MVP. And all these methods that were being created at the time, like smoke tests, which were new, and more traditional research methods, all could be considered an MVP for a team. And when I work with teams, there's sometimes a lot of confusion about really what an MVP is. So we hope to clear that up in this session here, and talk now about lean validation. And I'm going to anchor on the idea that MVP is a product, and it's important for your teams to view it as a product. Now, when I think about learning loops, and one thing about the building first, sort of putting a product out there isn't always the best first move you can make. And it depends on your context, and we'll be going through some case studies later. But as I distilled the learning loop down to its simplest, I really think you should just have this model in your head, particularly if you're in product management, product owner space, right? As you start with discovery, you get some insights, and you try and validate them. So very much still the idea is how quickly can I move through this learning loop? But it's just a simple two-step learning loop. You might want to use build, measure, learn. You might want to use, plan, do, check, act. You might want to use OODA loop. What is it? Orient, observe, decide, act. There are different learning loops we can go through. But when you boil them all down, it's about this: discovery, validation. That's what we're always doing. And if we got a good Agile team, we can be doing that dual track idea, right? That is, the new product comes off the line from the sprint, we can be out testing that and getting feedback, getting validation. Now, most new products, you got to go through these phases. And I'm showing them here very serially. You don't necessarily always need to start and go left to right. But you will need to pass through them, and typically products pass through them in this order. We start off with validating a need. That's where we try and understand, do we have a problem that's worth solving? We move on to perceived value. That's when we do a concept test. That's what a smoke test was. It's a concept test. Do people think this is valuable? And then finally, the third one is we actually give them that MVP. We put something in their hands and say, did they realize value out of this product? Now, when you're going and doing this validation, there's this fork in the road. We can validate on the behavior side, or we can validate on the belief side. If we think about beliefs, this is an example of someone's beliefs. New Year's resolutions. I don't know how many people here. Are we familiar with creating them? Okay, and how often does the behavior match the belief of what we're going to do? Yeah, maybe not so good all the time, right? A little, saving money, exercising to get fit, maybe for about a month. Hopefully, some of them got hit off, right? So belief can definitely diverge from behavior if you're on the consumer side of the world, if you're dealing with products that have more emotional triggers. Definitely what users believe and how they behave differ a lot more, sometimes than in the B2B side. And then there is behavior, right, where we see, what do people actually do? What happens when you leave them alone in a room with a tray full of desserts? How are they going to behave versus what they might have told us how they would behave? And one of the methods I teach teams is called Key Question Chain Testing Grid. It's a larger process for creating a testing plan, one that you can put budgets behind and get executive buy-in. But quite simply, it starts on the horizontals, right? We have behavior, we have belief, and then moving across, or should I say on the vertical, let's split behavior, belief, moving across on the horizontal, we have needs tests, perceived value test, realized value tests. The top part, the behavior, and for me, that was the real power of Lean Startup, its emphasis on really doing behavioral testing. That's what people do. The bottom part is why they do it. And you need both, because you can see what people do, but until you really get a deep understanding of what's their motivation behind it, it's hard to do anything but actually A/B test, right, which is just trial and error. That's Edison, right? 99% perspiration, just trial and error, every single filament. But you can learn a lot also by talking to people and understanding why they do things. This is not meant to be comprehensive. I hope, I don't know, can you read it in the back? Is it big enough? Still? Okay, meant to be, yes? You're saying that you can read it? Okay. So just a couple in each category. For behavior, we can just observe what people do, and they don't necessarily need to know they're being observed. Or you can do shadow someone, right? And go along with them as they go through their day or go through their work and see how they actually behave. On the belief side, we have very traditional market research methods, doing problem interviews, asking people to rank problems. Then we have the perceived value of solution. A great one, particularly if you're in like B2B space, is pre-orders. If you can get someone to commit that they will buy your product, that's a great sign and signal that they perceive your your product will deliver value to them. The other one is the offer smoke test, Ash Mayura, who writes eloquently about Lean Startup, and that is a demo, a value proposition, and a price point to be able to go out and do those kind of smoke tests and see will people click through and buy. On the belief side, we can give someone a concept document, we can step them through wireframes, and we can have them react and give us their views on do they think this would be valuable to them, the solution, the way it's architected and designed. And then finally, we get to that upper right there. And there's a star there, because we don't really know we have something until we get to the true realized value test. And to me, that's the power of the MVP, is putting something small in someone's hand and saying, can we really deliver the value? They perceived value, they thought it would work. Is it really going to work for them? The other great sort of measure there is renewals and retention. The problem with those is it's lagging. But if someone signs up, right, and then they pay to use your product more, they continue with it, we know we're delivering value, right? So it's a great measure. The other ones on the belief side also lagging, things like satisfaction interviews. We can do surveys, we can track Net Promoter Score. Those are good measures longitudinally, not good sort of instant measures. So I work with teams to think about sort of the MVP, and as I define it, it's the smallest product that will meet the need of a narrow user segment. So we're normally talking early adopters. They have to be in acute pain because this product's still going to be rough and not do everything for them. I think it's really important that they exchange value, ideally money to use it, so that we can now learn from how they use it. That's what we want to get out of it. But the value exchange is a really key thing. And the test, sort of the litmus test for me, is that they would rather use your product as is than wait for the next release. Right? Then you'd know you've hit MVP. Now, it doesn't mean they will stay on your product if you don't continue to improve it. But the fact is, it takes enough of their pain away, even with all the warts in that product, that they will want to use it. And then MVP tests, we can think about those behavioral tests in the perceived value space. So it sort of looks like this. You got your MVP, and because that's the highest fidelity test, that's when we can really say, yes, this solution delivers value. We want to get there quickly. We have our MVP test in perceived value, and everything else sitting out here, that's really traditional market research methods. They've been around for a long time, and they still deliver a lot of value. Any questions on the model before we kind of move into case studies? Make sense? Yeah.
Does that MVP definition still work for when you're trying to make iterative improvements to your product rather than like your first launch?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
All of it makes much more sense when you're talking about your first launch. But I feel like I spend much more time in the iterative improvement.
Right.
Could you repeat that for me, Ken?
Oh, sorry. The question was, thank you for having me. Good speaker hygiene. Does that definition of MVP, is it the same if you're working on iterative improvements versus the first launch? And I would say, so I think, yeah, if you're working on iterative improvements, the principles are the same, but definitely this is much more about getting to first launch. I think, and it depends, I should say, how much you're changing. Is it a major change in your product, or are you really just doing small incremental optimization? Okay, and if it's sort of small optimization, I just consider that optimization. Yeah. I don't know that I consider that this big goal that we have to get to MVP.
Certainly and much easier when you're making larger changes.
Right, and how to say, and for me, there's this framework I have, but optimization in that quadrant, when you're in there, users know what your product does, right? And they know what problem it solves. We're not trying to create awareness. We're not changing major behaviors. So they can be really articulate as well about what they don't like about your product. So I also find you get much better fidelity in the belief side of the world.
There's less unknowns for certain.
Yeah, no, there's always exceptions. And for me, this is very contextual. So you don't just apply what works here over here, right? You got to understand, is this an area of a lot of uncertainty? Am I pushing someone into a whole new behavior of use that they've never done before versus am I just making this more efficient for them and they understand what this capability or feature does for them or product? So does that make sense?
Is that kind of the solving a new problem versus solving the current problem better?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think that's a great way. So did you catch that? Solving a new problem versus solving the problem better. I think that's a great way to phrase it. Any other?
Do you find your first MVP customers impacting your roadmap a bit more than what you would want the normal roadmap to be?
Right, I think you have to be cautious of that. Sorry, the question was, do you find your first MVP customers affecting the roadmap maybe more than you would like? And they can do that, because often your first MVP customers are sort of on the cutting edge, really pushing the bounds, and they may not be representative of your typical users or the market you're eventually going to want to go after. And one of the big tests, in crossing the chasm is, are these self-referential groups And I've had that situation, this was in, actually Instill, I think I have an example on Instill, which was in food service. We had one of the major bottlers of beverages as one of our customers. And we went out and we talked to other smaller bottlers. And they're like, well, I'm not like that. Right? That wasn't a referential customer for them that they could say, well, if they're doing it, I should be doing it. So you have to be really cognizant of that. And that's sort of what good product management is about, knowing what your target market is and where they are, as well as where these lead customers are. It's a great question.
I have a question. Somewhat goes off of that other one about the MVP.
Right.
Not so much optimization, but what if you're adding a new feature that isn't optimizing anything you've done, something new that's part of your product, but it's just a new feature?
Right. Okay. So the question was, what if you're adding not a whole new product, but a new feature that wasn't part of your product? In that case, you're probably looking, I would model it much more as it's a new product, right? Particularly if you have uncertainty. And one of the big differences too is, like if you are adding a feature that users already would expect in that product, right? The market's already established what that feature is. Once again, you don't have to do education. They know how that feature should work. You have less uncertainty. But if you're adding an entirely new capability that no one's ever seen before, you have very high uncertainty. Then in those areas, you want to compress those learning cycles, discovery validation loops. And I would say I would push to get to MVP faster because of that, because you need to do learning on it as well. Okay.
Well, back to your question, that was kind of interesting because I've worked in new product engineering and in continuation engineering. And in the continuation side, I'm kind of finding the MVP really valuable as far as just creating the boundary within which that cross-functional team can decide to close the door to distraction. So when you can define a minimum viable product, even if it's for a continuation or what the woman up front was talking about, a new feature in an existing product, what I found the MVP good for is just to say, okay, we've defined what we're working on to the rest of the business. So it's kind of a leave me alone now, I know what I'm working on protection.
It's trying to.
So kind of like defining the scope.
Yeah, kind of because I've had a lot of experience where people within larger enterprises will tend to think of Agile as do the same thing only faster. And that's what it just gets in the minds of the upper middle, upper management. It's like, okay, we're Agile now, give it to me quickly. And so I found that if we can define MVP, what we're doing is right here. That's what we're doing. That's all we're working on. So go away and leave me alone.
Right. Yeah. So it's very valuable to use.
So that's how I find MVP.
I call it to contain scope as well.
Yeah.
Right. So you can stay focused.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let's look at a few some of the case studies. I'm going to pull from B2B to B2C here and talk about different contexts. So first one, for me, this was out of my background in Instill. So I said probably bad slide to show right before lunch, right? But we did supply chain information services for the food service industry. So Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, big companies like that, Applebee's. And they have these things, limited time offers. These are those sandwiches that show up for a month or something, the chicken, bacon, ranchy thing. And these are always hard to manage in the supply chain. Very difficult, and they got particularly acute for our customers when it coincided, these LTOs and some of these chicken sandwiches coincided with the mad cow disease scare that occurred. And everyone stopped eating hamburgers and they all switched to chicken sandwiches in unison. Now, as a little backgrounder, the way the food service supply chain works is you got a manufacturer, someone like Kraft, they're making mayonnaise, they're making ketchup. You have these distribution centers. Does anyone know the company Cisco, the original one with an S, that drives big trucks around? Right, well, they pick up stuff at the manufacturer, they house it in their distribution centers, they break up the entire pallet of ketchup, and they put a box of ketchup, a box of mayo, a thing of chicken breasts and buns, and they deliver a mixed set of goods to the restaurant units that are out on the right. So that's how the supply chain works. And our customers were talking about this pain they were having managing these things, and this was what they would do. On Monday, they would send an email off to the distribution centers, and they'd try and find out how much inventory they had of each of these units that made up the chicken sandwich, the LTO. And then they would hound the distributor for most of the week so that by Friday they got that data. So it was old. The best they had was 1 week as far as the currency of the data, and then they'd start that whole thing over. And they would use that to try and figure out, is a stock out imminent? Do I have to get the manufacturer to change their volumes on what they're manufacturing? Do I have to start shorting restaurants, right, to make sure that we can spread it out evenly? Do I have to shift supply between distribution centers? All sorts of things that they might have to do in this. And they wanted to know, since we were already collecting purchase data for them, we thought we could help them collect inventory data as well. So on this one, you talk about the need. I didn't need to go out and confirm that being able to do this would be valuable for our clients because they were already doing it, right? They were kludging together a solution. But what I did do that delivered certainly huge amounts of value was go out and do contextual interviews, understand their process, the data they collects, the way they manipulate that data, and the decisions they make. So we could build a system to support them beyond just collecting the data daily with greater frequency. From there, we sold it. We got our customers to pay for it and let us know that we could make a profit off this product, and decided what this would be worth if we could actually deliver on it. And we started sharing the mock-ups, the wireframes. This is how we're thinking of doing this. And then finally, we put it out there in the market with 2 sequential releases. The first one was just collecting data and automating the reporting, but because I had done these interviews, we were able to deliver a lot more in the report to keep them from having to do additional calculations. And then the next one is, well, why do you have to go in every day and look at the report? We'll give you alerts. We'll let you know if there's a problem, if it falls behind a certain threshold. And this is where you say your customers, they're not designers, they don't know what technology is. It might seem really obvious. This was not on their radar screen at all. Right, that we could do this additional thing and do the push to them. And then continue to interview to see how satisfied they were. And most of the issues turned out not to be the product. The contextual interviews really nailed what the product should do. It was more on data quality from the distribution centers and working through those problems. Interestingly, the third part, my grand vision, was what's called vendor managed inventory. Right? Well, like if it's all this stuff you do or you get on the phone with the vendor, why don't we just give them insight into the data? And we didn't build this initially. And it's a good thing I didn't just go out and start building, because in talking to our customers, they weren't comfortable with that yet. They needed to get comfortable with that the system worked, it was accurate, before they were going to give a view to the manufacturer to manage their own inventory. So it's very simple things, right? I could have overbuilt the solution had I not done that earlier work. But also I could have, and so this would have been overbuilding and not adding any value. Right, but I also could have said, no, we had to have alerts in there, but this much thinner slice that we could get out in a few months delivered immediate value. So that's one example, once again, where the need is well known. Let's talk about Zappos. People familiar with what Zappos does? Okay, what do they sell? Shoes. They sell shoes online. Does Zappos, do they need to confirm whether people are going to wear shoes? No. Do they need to confirm that people will even give money to get a pair of shoes, right? So those things were well in there, but they were changing something, which was, would people buy shoes online, which is a big thing for a product you usually go into a store and you actually try on before you purchase it, right? So they're pretty famous. I don't know how many people know their MVP. They moved to MVP really fast. I don't know, I assume they did do some interviewing to see what objections people might have to this. But they knew they needed to get to MVP because they needed to really know behavior. They couldn't trust that someone said I would or I wouldn't buy shoes online. So they went down and found a shoe retailer and did a little deal, which was, I'm going to take pictures of your shoes, I'm going to post them online, and whenever anyone buys them, I'm going to come down to your store and I'm going to give you money for it, and you'll give it to me and I'll ship it off. Right? So they're not carrying inventory, they're not building warehouses. It's a really simple model. But they are testing true behavior, right? And they're doing it very inexpensively as a test and very quickly, because the shoe store is already there. They just had to take photos and build the website. So that's an example where, build, measure, learn, to me makes huge sense. I wouldn't trust the Zappos business model without seeing true behavior. A little very different than, as I said, what happened with Instill, where they were already doing this process. Our job was to make that process more efficient. Another interesting one as far as slicing is Leonid Systems, and this is called the concierge model, where you do much of the product, you deliver that value manually. And later, when you prove that it works, you make it efficient and automate it more. So they were trying to make provisioning enterprise VoIP services simpler for telecom carriers. That's a mouthful. But basically, to get a VoIP system working, you have to update data in about 5 different systems. And it was a real challenge. So the first thing they did, they were a bootstrap startup. They sold to Broadcom. They sold a consulting agreement so they could study the problem. And they had expertise in this industry, so they were credible in being able to do that. Then, their first true product was a software script. That was it. A software script that, based on this CSV file, would populate the different systems that had to be run by a systems engineer. They sold that. Right? Someone was willing to pay for it. A very, very simple product. Then as that succeeded, they built an interface around that. And as that succeeded, because they're dealing with telecom customers who all have different equipments and systems, they had to decide what is in the core product, what should be professional services, and building clean interfaces so they could decide that. So they started off, right, this consulting agreement. Obviously, they sold it too, so they knew there was some value here that they were poking around in. They could understand the needs, they got money for it, and they delivered on it. So there was realized value. And then they went into this second stage, right, where they sold the software script, perceived value, again, someone paid for it, and then they delivered it and went through that model I showed you. Software script, building out a user interface that also allowed not just the bulk update, but you could go in and change individual users in the system, and then finally the interfaces. So once again, slicing value. So all along the way, you're decreasing risk and uncertainty around getting this product to market. Then there's GE Fastworks. This is GE's version of Lean Startup. It's going throughout the company from jet engines to appliances. So this is hard. This is a refrigerator, right? It's a big piece of hardware. It's much harder to update than software and get it out into the market. So they had this challenge for their Monogram line, can we get a working product in 3 months and can we bring it to market in a year? Which would, I think typically it was about 3 years for them to get to market. And they were able to do that. They did 18 revisions on it during that time. And now that the product's in the market, it's getting annual updates over a 5-year life cycle between updates. Now the interesting thing with them is they are testing it in their showroom. So they're really down here in this quadrant. They're only doing perceived value tests. It's in the showroom. They bring designers in to look at it and comment and give them feedback. They're not really getting to MVP with it, other than they're getting something early to market earlier, much earlier than they did, but their iterations are only happening in the perceived value space until you say, yeah, then they're going to do annual updates to it. So a little different process they're using, right? But this is a much harder product to rapidly iterate with. So questions on case studies and how that might apply? I mean, you hope you're getting a sense of how context really matters in moving these principles and applying them. Okay, let's just, I think we're actually really good on time. So wrap up. I want you to think MVP. It is behavioral validation. That's a real key thing. When we say we've done, put an MVP out there, we can talk about how real users are going to use our system or our product, and that we are confirming we are delivering value to the user. And we want to get to that test as quickly as possible. Because that's the thing, if you assume that anything can be an MVP, any type of test, teams can get really hung up hanging out in perceived value or problem research.
So again, the MVP, I'm thinking of a specific situation that I ran into in the last year, and there was a software product, and it was, they had a reasonably, one customer that was on the nibble line, right? So they had this concept, and one customer bought it, and I think it was to the question this gentleman asked here: how do you keep that initial customer from redirecting your product to too great an extent, because in this situation, this is a customer that was interested in buying, and it just, that MVP went like, it just turned into whatever the executives of this one
Right.
customer kept changing their mind to decide that they needed.
Give them a custom product.
Yeah, it did.
Yes.
So how, right, I guess to reiterate, because I'm looking at it just was so frustrating, because we ended up chasing our tails, because the executives wanted this product to be viable, and this is the only customer that had really nibbled, so they just chased that instead of taking the time to stand back and find the core of the product and realize that some of these other requests, it was just having your own custom development team that you didn't have to pay for. Like, oh, that sounds, maybe we need that.
Okay, wait,
It
so
wasn't
you-
quite that blatant, but that's what it felt
Right,
like.
okay, so how do you keep one customer, that first customer you land,
Really,
from really taking you off? So one thing you said is they had a custom development team they didn't
well,
have
it
to
felt-
pay for.
It felt
Okay.
as though.
But they did at least, there was a money exchange here?
Yes.
Or not?
Yes.
Yes or no? Okay.
Yes-ish. They were, yes-ish.
So I think it's important that, yeah, there is consideration given. From a product management standpoint, you have to be talking to more than just that one customer, right? Even if you haven't sold them.
And so
And
so from the development team side, the management would say, yes, my team's
Right.
my company's management would say, this is the minimum viable project, go work on that. And then they'd have a meeting with the customer and they'd come change that.
right.
So it was an internal conflict between the developers and the management within the organization that I was working. And,
Well, who held the vision for the product and the market it was targeting?
well, the management of the team that I was working for,
Okay.
and it kept changing because, so, I mean, I guess we didn't have the authority to say no, didn't take the authority to say no, what,
I mean, so that, obviously that you're gonna learn,
yeah.
right? Is in there. So like, even though, my vision is here and this is where I wanna go, you do have to be open, that some of what that customer's telling you is probably right.
Right.
Right,
There's
but
plenty, I know
you-
from hindsight, and
Okay.
at the time it was hindsight confirmed correct, that a lot of what the customer was saying was, they found a cow, they found free milk, or, for that analogy or whatever, so,
But you have to validate, you have to triangulate.
yeah.
And I think even going out and trying to sell it or sell different concepts of that, depending where that customer is taking you, to different customers, getting that feedback can give you data. So you can't push back against management if you don't have data.
Yeah,
And that data might just be, I've talked to 10 customers, and this is what they've told me.
yeah, okay. Okay.
And this actually, I sort of had this situation at Pandesic, which was an e-commerce company by SAP and Intel, where the CEO, not the CEO, but one of the executives came to me. He said, we got this problem. Our product's called the data jail. So it's an early e-commerce solution. There's all this data's going in, but no one can get to it. And we need a data warehouse. So go off and build a data warehouse. He paired me up with this brilliant engineer out of Visa who was doing big data before that was popular. And we went and we did this focus group. And we found out, I kind of split it between big and small customers. Our big customers, turns out, didn't want a data warehouse. They had a data warehouse. They just wanted an extract, right? So, that wrong product, they could pay for it. Our small customers would have loved a data warehouse, but they would have paid about 5 times more for it than they were paying for our core product just to get reporting. So you have right product, wrong business model, and they could get by with just standard reports, right? So with that data, we've talked to customers. Although you're right, it's a data jail, we got to solve it. The way you've asked me to solve it isn't the right way. But if no one's going out and talking to more customers, management and you, the team's going to lose, right? Because you're not actually showing that you have expertise. Hopefully it gets to the point where management starts asking you, right? Because they know you're the expert.
So Greg, we ran
Hold on.
into this.
Wait, sorry.
We ran into this problem very early in a startup. We had a wonderful product that competed with HP, IBM, and others for equipment discovery. AT&T Wireless gave us $1 million. And guess what happened? It was a SaaS product, and they wanted it installed internally, so we had to change an entire set of overheads inclusive in the product, and we became their custom, cheap development house.
Right.
That's kind of.
Till somebody said that that goes against what we were doing, and that requires fortitude, and it
Not everyone
requires
has it.
breaking away from it,
Yeah.
because if you don't, your company is dead.
Right.
Did you use
No.
an agile process to build it?
Oh, well, they said it was
Yeah. Quote Agile. I mean, I will say it's a really tough challenge.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if you have that one customer, you need them to be your reference customer.
yeah.
They're the one that the case study is going to go to market with on why your solution's so great. And there is a give and take,
Yeah.
right? But if they're totally taking you off, so if your vision is being SaaS, it's not going to work. So you had a question, right?
I was just going to say
Or
that
hold
if you had used Agile, if you had retrospectives, you could have the whole team present, the fact that, we're customizing too much.
Yep.
Rather than you taking on management, have the whole team take on
Yeah,
management.
yeah.
Okay, so, Kim, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. So let's say that you have a product that you want to introduce as an MVP, and it's perhaps a combination of some products that you already have in the marketplace.
Right.
So say you're combining them into a dashboard or a consolidated offering. But you're not sure how this is going to land in the market, so that's why you're doing an MVP. How do you make sure that you don't cannibalize your existing product lines and halt sales while you're trying to get traction around your MVP to find out if it resonates in the market or not?
Right, I guess the question is, you're building a product with components of your existing products, such as a dashboard, and how do you test that and ensure you don't cannibalize?
Right, like so
Okay.
that people don't stop buying all the other components in the
Right.
meantime.
So I guess what is it?
This idea is a bad one.
You don't do an Osborne. I think that was the one they were famous for announcing their version 2 of their luggable computer, and everyone stopped buying version 1 and they went bankrupt because they were delayed on version 2. You don't, so, and for me, MVP, it's not something you launch to the market, right? You sort of leak it. You find some customers to work with. You try and
You have
sell
a
it.
very narrow customer base to choose from, though.
Hey, now this gets more interesting. It's always hard because there's so much context. So what's the fear? You think that if this dashboard's coming out, they're going to stop buying? Because usually it's sort of like an add-on, isn't it?
No, not
Or-
necessarily, because they're gonna thinking about combining multiple existing products into one and it living under a dashboard.
Mhm.
So it could be like
And-
the 3 products are all gonna be rewritten and become one new big project
Mhm.
under a dashboard. Or maybe people hate it all being like that, and then we'll just keep selling the 3 separate ones.
Right. So you have the components, though. So first I would say, can you test this without rewriting?
Not
Make-
without significant performance issues. This feels like
Okay,
a really
so-
live
Yeah, well, it often is.
Yeah,
It's often not a
it's
quick
solution.
answer. So just real quick, so often that's where I spend a lot more time in perceived value if you can't get to an MVP quickly or you can't fake it in some way. I would say, yeah, you definitely don't want to rewrite the whole thing
Right.
and spend all that only to find out no one wants it. Right, so I would start on some of those earlier tests, concept testing, perceived value testing.
Okay.
Even if you got to, pull their data out and create a custom demo with their data, because I find that makes a big difference in how people respond.
Thank you.
Okay.
That was helpful.
Did you have a question in the back?
It was
Or
a
a-
question. I was
oh,
curious
okay.
what the outcome was from the business perspective versus what the outcome hoped for the customer
Mhm.
in that situation. Because I worked with a company that did exactly that, but the outcome was being driven by how do you get into the organization to begin with, rather than just swing for the fence with every sale of selling like your whole thing, the
Right.
big offering. So you get the big sales, and I think the difference is, what are you trying to prove? I mean, if you think you have a way to like plant yourself so you become so sticky that the other components, as the people get awareness of their importance, just go, well, this is the obvious choice because it's connected and it'll talk to each other. But I guess that's what the outcome there to me is, what you're trying to prove for the business or for the customer.
Right. So you're saying the idea that, there's joint value, right, in these pieces, more selling the suite. Okay. Other questions?
So there's one question.
Yes.
So in large
That's what we're doing
companies,
on time.
especially in financial organizations, there's an existing product. And as time goes by, technologies, et cetera, go out of code and you have
Right.
to replace it. How do you think about an MVP in a situation like that?
So how do you think about MVP when you're moving to a new technology?
When you're replacing existing product.
Right. So if you're not, are you going to actually change capability?
In most cases, the capabilities aren't going to change. What is going to change is the technology supporting the capabilities.
Right. So I don't consider that a real MVP challenge, but I do like, what is it, the strangulation pattern, where as you're getting rid of an old technology, you do it in little increments, and you build clean interfaces so that part of the functionality can live in the new system, part can live in the old system, and you might not have interfaces to make that happen. So you didn't spend 2 years rewriting this on the new technology and then have all sorts of issues when you try and go live with it.
Technologically very challenging, but I understand what you're saying.
But I think that one is a very safe and measured way to make that happen.
You hope it stays on for 5 years so you can leave the company back.
Hopefully not.
You don't want to wait.
But I would look at that's something called strangulation pattern and seeing if you can implement that. I think it's a safer way to go. Okay. Final questions? Okay, this is good because you get first dibs at lunch. And hopefully it's set up. So thank you very much.